Heinz Guderian, the Panzer general. Most discussions of Heinz Guderian begin and end with the same familiar image, the father of Blitzkrieg, the Panzer pioneer whose ideas revolutionized warfare. His name is, synonymous with speed, with the slashing armored columns that tore through Poland and France. But this popular image, largely shaped by Guderian himself in his best-selling memoir, Panzer Leader, is one of the most successful and enduring myths to emerge from the Second World War. The reality is, honestly, far more complex and far more instructive for anyone trying to understand not just how wars are won, but how militaries think, how doctrines are really born, and how a general's legacy is often written not in battle, but in the quiet years after defeat. The common misconception is that Guderian invented a new form of warfare called Blitzkrieg out of thin air. In truth, the term Blitzkrieg was never official German doctrine. It was a Western journalist's invention. What Guderian actually did was synthesize, champion, and politically sell a concept, the armored idea, that was already simmering in the minds of theorists in Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. His genius wasn't purely technical, it was political and pedagogical. He understood that to break the stranglehold of traditionalist thinking in the German army, he needed to demonstrate, persuade, and above all, write. His 1937 book, Achtung, Panzer, wasn't just a technical manual. It was a political manifesto designed to secure resources and recruits for a new kind of combined arms force. But there is a darker, more instructive lesson here. Guderian's story is a masterclass in the danger of the apolitical officer. A man so focused on the tactical and operational level of war that he willfully blinded himself to the strategic and moral abyss his sponsor was leading him into. To understand the Panzer general is to understand how a brilliant military mind could be used by a criminal regime and then spend the rest of his life trying to scrub his reputation clean. To understand the reality of Guderian, we have to first dismantle the myth of the lone genius. After the war, a cadre of former German generals, with Guderian at the forefront, wrote their memoirs with a specific agenda. Facing a world that viewed their nation as a pariah, they sought to rehabilitate the image of the German officer corps. Their narrative was simple. Hitler was the madman, the SS were the criminals, and the Wehrmacht were professional soldiers, fighting an honorable fight. Guderian's Panzer Leader was a cornerstone of this so-called clean Wehrmacht myth. In his telling, he was the primary architect of the Panzer force, battling bureaucratic fools to bring his vision to life. But historians like Russell Hart have since demonstrated that this was a self-serving distortion. The development of Germany's armored force was, in fact, a collaborative effort. Men like Oswald Lutz, Guderian's immediate superior, and Walter Nering were instrumental. Lutz, in particular, was the bureaucratic shield behind which Guderian could operate, protecting him from the consequences of his own abrasive personality, while working just as tirelessly for the Panzer cause. Guderian was the charismatic public face, but honestly, he stood on the shoulders of others. His memoir conveniently omits the massive bribes Hitler gave to senior generals, including Guderian, to ensure their loyalty. It glosses over the chaotic reality of the 1938 annexation of Austria, where his panzers broke down in droves, ran out of fuel, and would have been annihilated in a real fight. Guderian presents this as a triumphant march. In reality, it was a logistical near-disaster that exposed the fragility of his still-developing doctrine. Now, let's move beyond the man and into the operational reality he championed. For the survivalist and the student of warfare, the key takeaway from Guderian's campaigns isn't the glory of the charge, but, well, the brutal, unforgiving logic of supply and logistics. Guderian understood something fundamental. A tank is not a weapon. It is a system. And a system is useless without fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. His pre-war writings stressed this. In Achtung, Panzer, he posed two critical questions that are often overlooked. How will a mechanized army be supplied with fuel over hundreds of miles? And how will it be kept running when vehicles break down at a rate far exceeding combat losses? These weren't abstract concerns. During the 1940 invasion of France, Guderian's drive to the coast was constantly jeopardized by his own high command, who, thinking in the tempo of 1918, feared his flanks were exposed and repeatedly tried to halt his advance. Guderian's success came from disobeying orders to stop, pushing his men to the point of exhaustion to maintain the Schwerpunkt, the focal point of the attack. But the true test of his ideas came in 1941 during Operation Barbarossa. The campaign of his 2nd Panzer Group in the Soviet Union is honestly a case study in the limits of speed. He led the charge, cutting through border defenses and participating in the giant encirclements at Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev. But with every mile gained, his combat effectiveness just bled away. The distances were vast, the roads turned to dust or mud, and the logistical tail stretched to a breaking point. Guderian was a master of the tactical and operational advance, but he could not outrun geography. His panzers were halted not just by Soviet resistance, but by the simple fact that they had outrun their own supply lines, a lesson every military planner must internalize. By the time his forces stumbled towards Tula, in sight of Moscow, they were a spent force, and Guderian was relieved of command. This brings us to the most uncomfortable lesson of Guderian's career, the Faustian bargain. Guderian was not an early member of the Nazi Party. He was a Prussian traditionalist, a nationalist who saw in Hitler a strong leader who promised to restore Germany's military power. He was, as historian Russell Hart describes him, less a Nazi than a Hitlerite, a man personally loyal to the Führer because Hitler supported his panzer divisions. This loyalty came at a price. To advance his career and his ideas, he was willing to accept the regime that came with them. There is no evidence he was an anti-Semite in the rabid Nazi sense, but he chose to mentally dissociate himself from the persecution and violence being unleashed in his homeland. This willful ignorance is a form of complicity. His troops carried out the Criminal Commissar Order on the Eastern Front, an order demanding the immediate execution of captured Soviet political officers. In his memoirs, Guderian lied, claiming the order never reached his Panzer Group. A statement historians have proven to be an outright falsehood. He accepted large secret cash gifts from Hitler, binding himself to the regime financially. And in the aftermath of the July 20th, 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler, Guderian agreed to serve on the court of honor that expelled suspected officers from the military so they could be tried and executed by the Nazi People's Court. This was not the act of a man above politics. This was a man actively participating in the regime's judicial murder of his fellow officers to prove his loyalty. Heinz Guderian was a military innovator of the First Order. His understanding of mobile warfare, combined arms, and the psychological impact of the armored thrust changed the face of conflict forever. But his legacy is a warning. He reminds us that operational brilliance is not a substitute for moral clarity. The skills that make a great general, focus, drive, and the ability to ignore distractions to achieve the objective, can become fatal flaws when applied to the world of politics and ethics. His story is not just about how to win battles. It is about the stories we tell ourselves after we lose. It is about the creation of myth to obscure uncomfortable truths. Guderian the myth is a hero of military efficiency. Guderian the man was a brilliant, ambitious, and deeply compromised figure who hitched his star to a criminal enterprise and then spent his final years trying to hide the fact. Understanding that distinction, seeing past the myth to the man, is the only way to truly learn the hard lessons of history. If you value this kind of in-depth analysis, looking beyond the surface to understand the real mechanics of war and the men who wage it, make sure you subscribe to War Machina. Hit that like button and share this video with anyone who understands that history is never as simple as the legends would have us believe.